The hospital halls were busier than was normal for that time of the day, with hurrying medical personnel and visiting relatives, all scurrying to their destinations. The near-constant flow through the halls was the lifeblood of the hospital, a sign of its life. However, one figure remained in the hall, pausing from the rush to look up at the clock for a moment. He was a thin man, nearing 50 years old though looking 10 years younger. Running a hand through his blonde hair then blinking his blue eyes, he let out a sigh. It was only 2 more hours before his shift ended, though there was no guarantee that he'd actually be able to go home at that time. Michael was an RN at the hospital, having been so for quite a number of years. He had been a registered nurse long before the more modern thought considered it an acceptable career for a man. However, he had endured the countless jokes with some amusement, quickly reminding any of the detractors of the amount of time that he got to spend surrounded by beautiful young nurses. "I guess I'd better get on with my rounds," Michael muttered, tiredly. Then, Michael noticed a rather strict-looking woman in her 50s walking down the hall. He immediately recognized her as Dr. Scroggins, a rather unpleasant and humorless sort. She seemed to take the view if anything was fun, it must be bad for you. Suddenly Michael chuckled slightly, improving his mood as he thought about slipping a small amount of laxative into her morning coffee. That would certainly loosen her up. If it wasn't for the fact that he'd get fired. Then, still smiling faintly, Michael returned to work, his mood definitely improved. Several minutes later, Michael stepped into a room and picked up the clipboard, noticing that there was a new patient whom he didn't recognize. An older-looking man with gray hair and a well-trimmed beard was leaning back in the raised hospital bed, a thick book in his hands. "Hello," Michael introduced himself to the man, "I'm Michael." The man looked up from his book for a moment then set it down, giving Michael a quick glimpse at the cover. It was a dark brown leather with a title that was written in some other language, or at least that was what he thought since he couldn't be sure. "Document. Mr. Aldrich," the old man said, holding out his hand for Michael to shake. Michael hadn't missed Mr. Aldrich's slip, deciding that he was likely a doctor, or retired doctor who was embarrassed at being in the hands of others. After all, doctors did tend to make the worst patients. Mr. Aldrich gave Michael a steady look before asking, "What kind of man becomes a nurse?" He shook his head, muttering something about changing times under his breath. "The kind who likes to spend all day around hot young nurses," Michael responded with a wink, getting a chuckle back from Mr. Aldrich. He knew that it wasn't exactly professional to chat with the patients that way, but he was a believer in the old adage that humor is the best medicine. "I suppose so," Aldrich chuckled, "I suppose so. Let's see," Michael mused, looking at the chart in his hands. "Heart attack, huh?" At Aldrich's nod, Michael told him, "Don't worry, sir, you'll be back out and eating steak in no time." Aldrich snorted, "My dear boy," making Michael nearly choke at being called boy. "I am a strict vegetarian." "Sorry," Michael quickly apologized. After that, Michael took Mr. Aldrich's blood pressure then brought in dinner and medication, making sure that Aldrich took the pills before continuing to the next room. When Michael came back a little later, he told Aldrich, "I'm about to get off shift so you'll be having another RN in here to check up on you in a while." Mr. Aldrich nodded, setting his book to the side again and giving Michael a faint smile. "Make sure that she's one of those hot young nurses that you mentioned." Then he gave Michael a wink. "Sure thing," Michael grinned back before leaving the room. A minute later, Michael looked at the patient assignments and chuckled, making a slight change in who was going to look after Mr. Aldrich. He chuckled as he put down Mary Burke, unable to resist having a little fun at Aldrich's expense. Mary was anything but a hot young nurse. She was nearly as old as Michael but looked a bit older, also being badly overweight and with a face that only a mother could love. However, in spite of the fact that she tended to be a bit pushy with patients, she was a very skilled RN. She took great care of her patients, though they rarely enjoyed it at all. And just before leaving, Michael caught Mary and tried to hold back a grin as he told her, "Mr. Aldrich in room 306 could probably use a sponge bath." Then he chuckled as he hurried out, almost feeling a little sorry for what he'd done to Aldrich. Michael slowly made his way across the grocery store parking lot, his hands filled with what would soon be his dinner. He smiled faintly, trying to make the best of his day off, not to mention the pleasant weather. Then, just when his car was within sight, Michael was startled to notice someone walking towards him. It was an old man, dressed in a long brown overcoat and with a brown hat on, a cane held firmly in his hand. "Ah, Michael, my dear boy," the old man greeted the surprised Michael with a surprise. "That is your name, isn't it?" "And you are?" Michael asked, thinking that the man looked very familiar but unable to place where. "Aldrich," he stated simply. "We met at the hospital several weeks ago." Aldrich's voice dropped slightly as he added, "You left me with a very unpleasant nurse." Michael's eyes widened in recognition, now remembering where he'd seen the old man before. "Now this is definitely a surprise," Aldrich mused. "I come to the store for squash and find a volunteer." "Volent." Michael started, but before he could complete it, Aldrich raised his hand, holding some sort of strange-looking device in it. A second later, there was a flash of light and Michael stood there a little stunned, quickly finding that he wasn't able to either move or speak. Mr. Aldrich smiled faintly, putting the device back into his pocket. "I suppose that should make you a little more cooperative." As Michael stood there, staring at Aldrich and unable to move, he was a little curious to notice that he wasn't nearly as afraid as he would have expected, nor as angry. Instead, it seemed as if his emotions were nearly as motionless as his body, leaving only faint emotions. "Now come this way," Aldrich instructed. Then Michael started following Aldrich, not really having consciously intended to do so, but doing so nonetheless. Still, even though he was now moving, Michael couldn't bring himself to get away from Aldrich. After this, Aldrich had Michael climb into the passenger seat of another car and buckle himself in. A minute later, they were out of the parking lot and driving to who knew where, with Michael helpless to do anything but what Aldrich instructed him to. A short while later, they pulled into the driveway of a rather nice-looking house. The lawn was well kept, spotted with numerous patches of well-trimmed shrubs and flowers. As they got out of the car, Aldrich commented, "I do so enjoy a nice yard. It's a nice change of pace." Michael was still unable to respond, though he did pay attention with some curiosity. Once they were inside the house, Aldrich told him, "Do not fear, dear boy. Your condition, though useful for ensuring cooperation, is very temporary." Then he added, "You may speak freely." "Why are you doing this to me?" Michael asked, meaning to demand but unable to get much force of will behind it. Aldrich just smiled faintly as he took off his coat and hat, setting them on a hook before gesturing, "Come this way and I will show you." And with that, Aldrich started off down the hall, making several turns before finally coming to a pair of heavy-looking wooden doors. After Aldrich had unlocked them, he went inside, telling Michael to come in as well. "Welcome to my laboratory," Aldrich announced proudly, gesturing around the huge room that was filled with tons of unrecognizable equipment. Some of it looked like it had come straight out of a science fiction movie though. "You are here to assist me with my latest experiment." A faint surge of fear ran through Michael, though still dampened by whatever it was that Aldrich had done to him. "You're a mad scientist?" he gasped, not sure whether he should scream or laugh. It was like the plot out of some bad B-movie. "No!" Aldrich snapped, suddenly turning angry. "The mad ones are those fools who call themselves scientists, trying to discover the way the universe works while wearing a pair of blinders. They refuse to look at anything that doesn't fit in their view of the world." He snorted, calming down as he gave Michael a steady look. I am a student of what I call the eccentric sciences." "Eccentric sciences?" Michael repeated without understanding. Aldrich smiled and his features took a different look. "The study of the nature of the universe, without the blinders," he stated, sounding as if he was a college professor giving a lecture. "Science, magic, alchemy, they are all parts of the whole. It is the study of those, the lost knowledge of history, alien technology and everything else that is often overlooked and ignored." Pausing for a moment, Aldrich rubbed at his beard, his eyes sparkling with an inborn light. "Sadly, there are not many of my sort. There are very few who lack the discipline and commitment. And of course," he frowned, "it does have a great deal of risk as well." Michael nodded faintly, as much as he could though there was nothing else he could really move. What kind of risk? Aldrich shrugged. That depends. The unknown is often dangerous, sometimes even lethal. He sighed and added, the Atlanteans were the first eccentric scientists, though unfortunately one of their own experiments had disastrous results. Thinking to himself that Aldrich was obviously insane, Michael asked, "What are you going to do to me?" With that, Aldrich blinked, snapping out of his lecture mode and moving towards some machine that looked sort of like a silvery metal telephone booth but with wires and cables coming out of it and leading to several other machines. This is an experiment combining a failed alien device with Atlantean technology. Aldrich turned and looked intently at Michael, a thoughtful expression on his face. I need to ensure the success and stability on a human being before I attempt to use it on myself. Michael almost smiled as he commented, but I thought that it was a tradition for mad, eccentric scientists to test things on themselves. Only those who do not wish to live to a ripe old age, Aldrich responded with a chuckle. Speaking of which, that is what this experiment was designed to alter for me. Then he looked straight into Michael's eyes and chuckled, but first. Why me? Michael asked nervously, still unable to do much more than wiggling his fingers on his own. Still, that was an improvement over several minutes earlier. Aldrich just smiled. Why not? Then he continued, you played an unpleasant joke at my expense, though I had all but forgotten about you until I saw you at the market. He smiled even more, adding, I do believe in fate. I'm sorry, Michael started, but Aldrich paid him no attention. Let's see, Aldrich mused to himself, rubbing at his beard thoughtfully, a nurse. Then after a few seconds, he started chuckling. Perfect. Then Aldrich went to some strange-looking panel that was connected to the telephone booth and did something, though Michael couldn't make out what. But I thought we got along great, Michael tried again, I was nice to you. Aldrich paused at that and gave Michael another look. That is true, he mused. Unlike the other nurses, you were rather amusing to talk with. Then as Michael began to feel relieved, Aldrich continued, however, I still need a volunteer and you are available. No. Michael gasped. I shall tell you what, Aldrich said with a mischievous grin, since you were rather kind before your joke, I will give you a little something extra to go along with the experiment. Now please enter the booth. Michael protested, to no effect. Aldrich didn't change his command, so Michael walked straight into the booth, feeling extremely apprehensive as the doors closed. A moment later, there was a strange humming from around him, coming from the very walls of the machine. Suddenly Michael felt a cold chill run through his whole body, then everything seemed to change. It took a second before he realized that one of the lights inside the booth was now several inches above eye level, where before the chill, it had been just below. And at that moment, the door opened again and Aldrich ordered Michael to come out. Stepping out of the booth, Michael stared at Aldrich, startled to realize that the mad, eccentric scientist looked taller. At the same time, he suddenly realized just how different he felt. His whole body felt wrong. It worked, Aldrich exclaimed triumphantly. What the? Michael started, looking down and staring at himself in shock. His whole body had definitely changed, as had his clothes. A single glance was more than enough to show that. He grabbed at himself, not sure exactly what it was that Aldrich had done to him, but knowing that it couldn't be good. Interesting, Aldrich commented, causing Michael to turn his attention back towards him. It seems that the process neutralized the effect of my controller. It wasn't until just then that Michael realized that he was able to move on his own again. He stretched his arms out experimentally and then looked at Aldrich, mentally gauging how quickly he could jump the old man. However, Aldrich seemed to expect something of the sort because he already had the strange device in his hand again. I don't think that I need to use this again, Aldrich commented, at least as long as you cooperate. Then he laughed excitedly, gesturing towards the wall. Come, hurry. Look. Michael looked to where Aldrich directed him, noticing that there was an old-fashioned full-body mirror set up next to the wall. With a nervous gulp, Michael glanced first at Aldrich and then himself before starting towards the mirror. I. Michael stumbled, staring at the reflection in the mirror with stunned disbelief. The person in the mirror wasn't the thin, middle-aged man that he was used to seeing. Instead, it was an extremely different reflection, having very little in common except for the somewhat similar clothes. Instead, it was the reflection of a very cute young Asian woman in her early 20s, dressed in a feminine variation of the shirt and pants that he had been wearing before. There was no doubt that she was a bit smaller than Michael had been as well, and though very slender, still a bit curvy. She had long black hair to her shoulder blades and almond-shaped oriental eyes to finish it off. "That's not me," Michael gasped, noticing that even his voice had changed. He sounded just like a young woman now. Aldrich just grinned proudly. "It worked." Michael snapped around and glared at him. "Why the hell did you turn me into this?" He gestured down at himself, still stunned by what he'd seen in the mirror. "Simple," Aldrich replied with a smile. "As my heart attack proved, I am an old man and not getting any younger or healthier. This device is going to change that. But before I turn myself into a young man, I wanted to ensure that it could reliably create such an extreme transformation. Your transformation is just such a test. There was little I could think of that as more extreme." Then Aldrich chuckled, adding, "And whoever heard of a man being a nurse?" He snorted. "It works," Michael growled, or at least tried to in his new voice. "So change me back already." "I don't think so," Aldrich told Michael with a chuckle. "I still haven't verified the stability of my device." He looked thoughtful for a moment before saying, "Perhaps in a couple weeks. If you cooperate, that is." The scientist gave Michael a steady look, finishing, "That should give enough time to verify that the changes are stable." "A couple weeks," Michael repeated in surprise. "Maybe," Aldrich corrected him. "If you cooperate and do exactly as you are told." Michael took a deep breath, trying to keep from screaming out in frustration. How could he stay like that for a couple weeks? Then again, as he thought about the fact that it could be reversed, he started to calm down some. "And what do I have to do?" Michael asked. Aldrich blinked. "Actually, I hadn't really considered that." He rubbed at his beard, musing, "I have little need of servants, so I suppose that other than being quiet about this and cooperating when I desire testing, you are free to go." With that, Michael let out a sigh of relief, half afraid that Aldrich would require something like sleeping with him. Then again, Michael rather doubted that Aldrich could even get it up anymore, which nearly made him chuckle, but not quite. "To do what though?" Michael asked sarcastically. "It's not like I can go back to work like this or anything." "That is true," Aldrich admitted, giving Michael a curious look. "However, that is not my concern. Come back tomorrow in case I require anything from you." Michael turned and started to walk away, muttering, "Thanks for nothing." "Nothing?" Aldrich exclaimed, obviously having heard Michael's grumbling. "I made you 20 years younger. I would hardly call that nothing." "True," Michael admitted weakly, "but you turned me into a girl too. And a Japanese one at that." With a shrug that showed that he didn't particularly care about those details, Aldrich stated proudly, "I also gave you a special present as a reward for your friendliness at the hospital." Pausing at that, Michael cautiously asked, "Special reward?" At that, Aldrich chuckled, "Though I am beginning to wonder why I did." He paused and straightened up before continuing. "To compensate for your smaller size, I have given you the ability to read, and perhaps even manipulate the minds of others." "What?" Michael gasped, almost positive that he hadn't heard correctly. "Of course I ensured that I am immune to those abilities," Aldrich told Michael smugly, "though I do have every intention of giving myself similar abilities once I verify the stability and use the process upon myself." Michael just stared at Aldrich for a moment, almost positive that the old man was having yet more fun at his expense. Or more likely, had gone start raving mad. After all, he was a mad scientist, even if he didn't admit it. But on the other hand, Michael reminded himself, Aldrich had already well proven that he was capable of things beyond normal science. For a moment, Michael looked back Aldrich and the machine that had changed him, tempted to just rush the old man and change himself back to normal. However, reality quickly slapped him in the face. Even if he did manage to get to Aldrich before the man used that strange mind control device on him, Michael still didn't have the slightest idea of how to operate the machine. No, there was no way that to get back to normal without Aldrich's willing help. Then, with a sigh, Michael turned and hurried out of the house, glad to be away from Aldrich and his Frankenstein's laboratory. He just wished that he didn't have to come back. Only a week or two, Michael reminded himself uncomfortably. I can live with it that long. At least he hoped that he could. A short while later, Michael was sitting on a city bus, looking out the window and wondering how long it would take to get back to his car. He snorted faintly, knowing that his license wasn't going to be much good if he got pulled over. Michael squirmed in his seat uncomfortably, feeling strange in his own body. His breasts certainly weren't the world's largest, but he was still extremely aware of them and of the size difference. Oddly enough, the absence between his legs was one of the least noticeable changes, at least until he consciously thought about it. Then, he looked up and glanced around the bus, at the other passengers. There was a fat woman with a heavy bag, an old man who was reading what seemed to be the Bible. There were two teenage girls, probably skipping school, and finally, there was a woman and her young son. For several minutes, Michael just watched them, then he remembered what Aldrich had said about his abilities. He snorted skeptically, then glanced down at his dainty girl hands with a wry smile. There was no harm in trying. After making sure that he was calm, or at least as much as he could be given the circumstances, Michael tried to open his mind, to listen with that rather than his ears. Then, to his surprise, he could suddenly hear them inside of his head. They sounded like voices coming from around him, blurred and confusing. Damn, Michael gasped in amazement, losing the voices with the distraction. Taking a deep breath, Michael tried it again, this time picking up the voices just a little easier. Still, there were too many to make out any details. Then, Michael looked at the mother, concentrating on her. With that, the other voices faded out almost completely while hers suddenly came to the front. Wish he'd sit still and shut up for just 1 minute, Michael heard the woman thinking. He listened to the mother for another few seconds, though it was all complaining and thinking about how bad her day had been. Then he shifted his attention to the son, who was similarly complaining, though about being bored and wishing he was watching TV. Figures, Michael mused. With that, Michael shifted his attention, listening first to one person then another until he had heard the thoughts of each person on the bus. None of them were particularly interesting, but the fact that he was able to listen in was incredibly exciting. Suddenly the woman grabbed at her son and snapped, "Will you please sit down?" However, when the boy wasn't cooperating, Michael smiled faintly and decided to try something else. He listened to the boy again, but this time pushed, "Sit down" towards the boy, hoping that it would work. To his surprise and relief, it did. The boy actually sat back down on the bus seat. The rest of the bus ride was fairly quiet, and before long Michael had picked up his car, adjusted the seat and mirrors for his smaller size and returned home, without the groceries that he'd originally gone to the store for. Once Michael was finally home, he slammed the door shut behind him and locked it. Leaning back against the door, he let out a breath that he hadn't been aware of holding, sighing in relief. "Home sweet home," he whispered. Then Michael slowly walked around his house, amazed at just how much larger everything seemed. At just how much higher the pictures on his walls were. His home was no longer the long familiar and comfortable place that it had been just that morning. Instead, it had become almost a mockery, taunting him with the familiarity that was just out of grasp. After several minutes of just slowly moving around his house, he stopped in the bathroom in front of the full-sized mirror, staring at his reflection in silence. He blinked, watching the Asian girl blink. He waved his hand, with her doing likewise. "Might as well get this over with," Michael muttered as he started to remove his clothes. Once Michael was naked, he stared at his body even more intensely, shifting his gaze between the reflection and the real thing. It still seemed so unbelievable, even as he ran his hands along the smooth skin of his transformed body. Michael continued to explore his body with both his hands and his eyes for some time, pausing when he realized that his nipples were hard and sticking out. And at the same time, his new genitals were becoming very moist. He was getting turned on just looking at himself. "This is interesting," Michael said cautiously, carefully fingering himself and gasping at the sensitivity. Carefully sniffing at the wetness on his finger, Michael shook his head in amazement. Then he looked back down at himself, thinking about what Aldrich had said about turning him back to normal in a couple weeks. Of course Aldrich had said maybe, but Michael was sure that this was just to motivate him to be cooperative. Now that he thought about it, he strongly doubted that the eccentric scientist would leave him like that permanently. "It's just temporary," Michael told himself, not having any direct proof but being sure that it was so. He refused to consider any other possibility. "I might as well." And with that, Michael scrambled towards his bedroom for a little further self-exploration. He spent the rest of the day inside his house, mostly naked as he took turns starting at his new body and masturbating. Michael glanced down at his watch, formerly a man's watch but having been feminized just as much as his body. It was nearly noon, the time that he'd promised himself that he'd go to see Aldrich. After all, Aldrich had said to come back the next day, but Michael didn't want to get there too early and possibly annoy the man. Frowning slightly, Michael looked up and at the people that wandered by. At the moment, he was sitting on a bench at the local mall, having decided earlier to venture into public again in his new body. To face his own nervousness about others seeing him as he had become. Even in the short time that he'd been a woman, Michael had noticed that people treated him differently than before. While on the bus, going into the mall, or even how the employees and other customers acted towards him in the stores. Some were more deferential, others seemed to think that he was fragile or delicate. And the ones that annoyed Michael more were the people who seemed to think that he was like a child. It was only some of the men he'd encountered who'd done the last. And of course there were also some of the stares. Fortunately though, no one had tried to hit on him yet. Still, Michael doubted that it would be too long before some guy tried to pick him up. "Damn Aldrich," Michael muttered, wondering if he might be able to convince the man to change him back earlier. It certainly wouldn't hurt to try. Then Michael closed his eyes for a moment, deciding that it was time for the other reason that he'd come to the mall. To try out his new abilities again, this time with more people to try listening in on. With that many people, there were bound to be a few interesting thoughts. With that, Michael opened his mind and listened to the thoughts around him. Again, it was all an incoherent babble, at least until he focused on one person. For the next several minutes, Michael remained where he was, listening in first one person that walked past and then another, though most weren't too interesting. However, when Michael listened to a man walking past, he gasped and then blushed at the things filling the man's mind. The man was thinking about what he planned to do to his girlfriend that night, with all the details. "Oh man," Michael gasped, blinking as the man walked away, and out of his range. Then with a grin, Michael focused on a teenage boy, this time half expecting the blare of pornographic thoughts that flittered through his mind. He remembered that at that age, he'd barely been able to think about anything other than sex himself. A minute later, he saw a gorgeous woman and listened in, surprised to find out that she was cheating on her husband with his sister. Michael nearly choked on that discovery as he tore himself away, blushing faintly and feeling like a peeping Tom. Then it dawned on him, that was exactly what he was. Still, he mused, it is kind of fun. He smiled faintly, comforted by the knowledge that no one would know about his spying. What they don't know won't hurt them. Suddenly Michael gasped in surprise, glaring at the man that he'd just been listening to. The man had been thinking what he'd like to do to Michael. Or at least the woman whom he thought Michael was. Fortunately, much to Michael's relief, the man didn't do anything more than look before walking away. Shaking his head, Michael muttered, "That was definitely more than I needed to know." For a moment, Michael just continued to stare at the man who'd been thinking those thoughts about him, then he smiled mischievously. Just before the man got out of range, Michael pushed a command towards the man, curious to see if it would work. Then, almost as if on cue, the man suddenly changed direction, heading straight toward the Victoria's Secret. Yes, Michael laughed, it worked. I think. He'd given the man a command to go and buy himself some lingerie, and try it on right there in the store. Then Michael noticed a skinny teenage boy who was about 15 or 16 walking towards a group of 3 girls the same age, a determined though nervous look on his face. A quick glance into his mind revealed that he had gathered his courage to ask the girl that he'd long had a crush on out for a date. When the boy reached the group of girls, he nervously asked a sexy blonde, I was wondering if you might, go to dinner with me? What? The girl gasped in obvious surprise. Suddenly Michael saw the thoughts fly through her brain, the shock of being asked out by that dweeb, and in front of her friends at that. Then there was the clearly formed intention to chew him out, to verbally castrate him and humiliate the poor boy in front of her friends. A cruel smile began to form on her lips. Michael grimaced, hating to see that happen to anyone. And with a grin himself, he gave the girl a push, then another. A blank look covered her face for a moment, then one of confusion. She looked at her friends as if for an answer, then back to the boy. However, as soon as she saw him, her expression changed again. Oh yes, the girl gasped out, staring at the boy with a dreamy smile. Then, to complete shock of both the boy and the girl's friends, she threw her arms around him and gave him a passionate kiss on the lips. That's more like it, Michael chuckled, deciding that he could definitely get used to his new abilities. He was certainly going to ask Aldrich to let him keep them when he was changed back to normal. And with that, Michael took another look at his watch, sighing before getting up and heading towards the mall exit. As fun as playing with his new abilities had been, he knew that he had to get to Aldrich's and hopefully talk the man into changing him back. Or at the very least, convince the old man to change him back when the time came. It didn't Michael long before he pulled into the street that Aldrich lived on, not sure whether to smile that he was little closer to getting back to his own body, or frown from the fact that he was still a girl, and likely to remain one for a little longer. However, just as Michael pulled up to Aldrich's driveway, he was startled to see an ambulance already there waiting. Then as he jumped out of his car, he was horrified to see 2 medics rushing a stretcher cart towards the ambulance. What's going on? Michael demanded, running towards the medics. Then at the looks the 2 men gave Michael, he blurted out, I'm an RN. That eased both of their expressions. Then Michael paused to look down at the stretcher, horrified to see that it was Aldrich laying motionless on it. Michael gasped, quickly looking back at the medics. Heart attack, ma'am, the first medic told Michael, still moving the stretcher into the ambulance. He called 911 as soon as it hit. Michael quickly reached for Aldrich, then let's get him to the hospital. At this, the second medic shook his head sadly, we got here too late. He's already dead. And as they fished loading Aldrich into the ambulance, in front of a stunned Michael, he continued, it must have hit while he was working on something because there's a big mess inside. And with a quick goodbye ma'am, the medics rushed off, taking Aldrich to the hospital, most likely to be declared dead on arrival. Shit, Michael gasped, staring at the quickly departing ambulance, more than a little tempted to rush to the hospital as well, just in case. However, he remembered what the medic had said and turned towards the house with a no. With that, Michael rushed into the house, the door having been left unlocked. He barely looked around as he rushed towards the back room, the one that served as Aldrich's laboratory. The heavy wooden doors were wide open, inviting Michael inside. A second later, Michael looked around the laboratory with a quiet gasp of horror. The phone booth that had changed him was sitting there, but the door was completely removed. As were most of the cables coming out of it, laying spread out along the floor instead. And even worse, the computer console that Aldrich had controlled everything with was half disassembled, with several circuit cards and odd-looking pieces spread out on the table. Oh shit, Michael gasped, quickly running to the messed-up machine and frantically trying to piece how it went back together. However, none of it made any sense to him. There seemed to be no real rhyme or reason to the assembled parts in front of him, nor any form of blueprint to put it back together. Damn it! Michael spent over an hour looking at the pieces and examining the laboratory for anything that would tell him how to put it back together again. About how he might be changed back to normal. However, there was nothing, and finally he was forced to admit his failure. This can't be, Michael whispered, sitting down and looking at the mess with a sinking feeling. Then remembering Aldrich being taken away, Michael dashed for the phone, muttering, "Come on," as he waited for an answer. Once the call was answered, Michael took a quick breath before he began. "My uncle was taken there for a heart attack and the medics said that he was probably dead." Michael paused, trying to sound as sad as he could. "Not a difficult task at the moment, I need to know." It only took another minute and a little more information, with him finishing, "Last name Aldrich." Finally, the receptionist on the other end came back, sounding sympathetic. "I probably shouldn't tell you this over the phone, but I'm afraid that he passed away before he even arrived here." Michael gulped, barely managing to whisper, "Thank you," before he hung up the phone. For several minutes, Michael just remained where he was before finally getting up and slowly heading towards the door, too stunned at the loss of Aldrich and the machine. He was trapped as a girl forever, with no way back to his old life. What was he going to do now? He wondered with a sinking feeling. It wasn't like he could just walk back into the hospital and take up his job again, not looking like he did now. "What'll I say?" he grumbled. "I just got back from Sweden?" He snorted. "I don't think so." There was no way that he could just go back to his old life now. Instead, he was forced to wonder what he could do instead. No ideas seemed to be forthcoming, however, as Michael instead kept glancing down at himself and wondering how he was going to survive being a woman permanently. However, as Michael reached his car, he paused, glancing at a neighbor woman who was standing outside and gardening. He listened in on her thoughts for a moment, thoughts about the merger that her husband's company was secretly planning. Michael blinked, shaking himself out of his shock and then looking down at his dainty hands with renewed amazement. Then at his breasts before finally looking back at the woman, a few ideas about what he could do with that knowledge beginning to form. "Oh my," Michael whispered, realizing that with his abilities, he could become quite rich indeed. Not just on the stock market either, but he could probably even convince people to just give him their money and then forget about it. "Oh my," he repeated, knowing that money wouldn't really be a problem. Any problems of his identity could be taken care of with a well-placed use of his new abilities as well. So a new driver's license and the like wasn't going to be a problem any more than getting money was. He'd just have to be careful was all. Continuing to think about his situation, Michael started to wonder if perhaps it wasn't quite as bad as he'd been thinking. After all, he was probably over 20 years younger, in excellent health and had incredible abilities. All in all, he had to admit that there was quite a potential for a great future. It might not be so bad being a woman, he admitted quietly, not sure that he completely believed it but knowing that sooner or later he would get used to it. He'd seen people get used to lots of strange things, so knew just how adaptable humans could be. "But I think I could do without periods." That was the part that was really starting to worry him. Shaking his head, Michael climbed into his car and started the engine, muttering, "I suppose it is time for a change." He had been getting a little tired of his career as an RN, dealing with the constant stress and feeling that he wasn't making any difference. Then Michael smiled faintly, deciding that maybe going back to college would be a good idea. He didn't quite know what he wanted to do with his new life yet, other than enjoy it, that was, but he figured that he'd make up his mind sooner or later. Maybe a lawyer, he mused, then chuckled, or maybe a doctor this time. Shaking his head, Michael glanced over at the neighbor woman and pushed a command into her mind. And as he pulled away, he couldn't resist chuckling at the knowledge that within a short time the woman would be on her way to the nearest adult toy store to stock up on a full load of extremely embarrassing items. As Michael drove off, thinking about what the future held for him, he felt a mixture of nervousness, curiosity, and hope. Though he didn't yet know what shape it would take, there was little doubt that it would at least be interesting, and a large change from his life as an RN. All because of a little eccentric science.